Wow, this deep dive, well, you weren't kidding about it being packed. Seashells, gold rushes. I mean, who knew it would all lead back to Bitcoin?
It's really something, isn't it? Like these threads, all these different parts of history and economics, they all intertwine. It paints this, well, a compelling picture of how we got here, how we think about value, money, the whole thing.
Right, I mean, you've got me thinking about ancient trade routes and, like, the birth of the internet all at the same time. It's a lot to unpack, though you gotta admit, it's pretty cool.
It certainly makes for a fascinating exploration.
It does. But let's back up a bit, maybe for anyone listening who isn't, as deep in the weeds as we are. Can you set the stage? What was it about that early internet scene, the very early days? What about it planted the seeds for something like Bitcoin to even be possible?
Well, picture the early internet. It was this kind of utopian experiment, right? The free flow of information, decentralized networks, this whole idea of minimal government control. Sound familiar?
It does. It's funny because it's like we're talking about Bitcoin, but it's all these echoes of like Hayek and that whole spontaneous order thing he was into.
Exactly. Hayek argued that, complex systems, languages, markets, those sorts of things, they could actually emerge and self-regulate without some central authority calling the shots, just individuals acting in their own interest. But there's a catch, especially when it comes to money.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because if markets are supposed to be so efficient on their own, why even have governments involved with money at all?
Hayek wrestled with that. He really did. He saw the value, no pun intended, in free markets, truly free markets. But he and other Austrian economists recognized that money, well, it's its own beast. It's not like a pizza, You value a pizza because you're hungry, it has a use. But money itself doesn't have inherent use.
Yeah, that's like, we've all agreed that these pieces of paper, these digital tokens now, they have value. But you can't eat them, you can't wear them. So where does that value even come from?
It's a question that's puzzled economists for centuries. But another Austrian, Ludwig von Mises, he offered an explanation, the regression theorem, he called it. Basically, the idea is this. The value of money today, it comes from our expectation that it'll have purchasing power tomorrow. Based on, how it's performed in the past, it's trust, really. We trust it because it's worked before.
So it's all built on this chain of trust going way back. And I guess historical precedent too. But doesn't that make the whole system kind of fragile? What happens if something shakes that trust? Or if governments meddle with things and mess with that precedent?
You've hit on a crucial point. When the value of something depends so much on belief, well, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation. And that's where something like gold enters the picture. Think about those gold rushes, especially in the American West.
There's something so, evocative about those times. And you're right, it wasn't just about striking it rich. It was, like people were drawn to gold. The fact that you could hold it, control it, it felt more real,
Exactly. And that leads us back to Hayek's dilemma. He saw the problems with a government-controlled system, but he also knew gold had practical limitations. It's heavy, hard to move around, needs a ton of security. And even with a gold standard, history shows that governments still interfered, devaluing currencies, causing chaos.
So gold wasn't perfect either. And then there's this thing you mentioned before, the Cantillon effect. Man, it feels like that's so relevant today, even more so than, well, ever. It's like when new money is created, it's those at the top who reap the benefits first, and everyone else is left dealing with rising prices, trying to catch up.
That's a great way to put it. The Cantillon effect, it basically just highlights how unevenly the effects of monetary policy are felt. Those closest to the source of that new money, often, governments and those connected to them, they benefit the most.
So we've got governments, potentially manipulating currencies, gold with its own drawbacks. It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Did Hayek offer any solutions at all, or was he just resigned to this endless loop of monetary mayhem?
Well, Hayek's solution. It was radical, to say the least. He actually proposed completely denationalizing money. Let the free market decide what works best, just like it does for, everything else. Goods, services, you name it. He firmly believed that competition would lead to a more stable and, importantly, a more efficient system in the long run.
And that brings us to the cypherpunks, right? This whole group of digital pioneers, hackers, they were really trying to build that alternative, that free market outside of the traditional system.
Exactly. These are people who were, deeply skeptical of centralized control. They were passionate about using cryptography, this new technology, to protect individual liberties.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just theoretical for them. Remember the crypto wars back in the 80s and 90s?
Vaguely. It was all about what governments trying to restrict access to encryption technology.
Yeah. And that only fueled the cypherpunks' determination even more.
Which, looking back, it's kind of amazing. Like, they predicted how important digital privacy, autonomy, all of it would become. I mean, here we are.
Their foresight was remarkable. And one of the earliest pioneers in this space, you had a guy named David Chaum. He developed something called eCash back in the late 80s.
eCash, right. I think I read about that. Wasn't that one of the first real attempts at creating, like, truly anonymous digital cash? I can't remember. Did it actually work?
It was groundbreaking for its time, for sure. But eCash, well, it faced a bunch of hurdles. The technology was really complex, so getting people to actually use it was a challenge. And there's some irony there, too, because as much as Chaum advocated for decentralization, he also wanted to patent every single aspect of eCash.
Oh, wow. So it's like that classic inventor's dilemma, wanting to protect what you've created, but also sometimes, letting go is the only way for it to truly succeed. But before we get too far into Bitcoin, there's another important piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah.
Hashcash. That started with, of all things, trying to stop spam emails, right?
Exactly. Remember how bad spam used to be? Inboxes flooded with junk. Hashcash, it was this clever solution. It forced senders to perform this small but computationally intensive task before sending an email.
Like a little puzzle their computer had to solve.
Right. This proof of work, as it's called, it just made it way too expensive for spammers to send out millions of emails at once.
It's amazing, though, that something designed to, fight spam would actually end up as a core part of like a revolutionary new type of money.
That's the beauty of ideas. But you're right, the core concept behind Hashcash, this proof of work, it introduced a way to bring scarcity to the digital world. Because think about it, in the physical world, the value of something like gold, it's tied to how rare it is.
Right.
Proof of work, it offered a way to achieve that digitally.
So instead of mining for gold, we're essentially mining for solutions to complex math problems.
Yeah.
And that's how you get digital scarcity.
You got it. And this leads us to another important figure, Nick Szabo, and his idea for BitGold. Szabo, he was really into the history of money, especially those early forms like, seashells. He was fascinated by how their scarcity, or unforgeable costliness, he called it, is what gave them value.
Okay, wait. Seashells as money. Now that's a new one. Tell me more about that. What's the connection there?
So Szabo, he realized that these primitive monies, they shared this key trait with what he envisioned for a digital currency, inherent scarcity. And that led him to propose BitGold. It would use proof of work to create this digital scarcity like precious metals, but online. But even Szabo, he couldn't quite figure out how to distribute BitGold securely without relying on some trusted middleman.
So close. It's really incredible to think about all these brilliant minds all circling around these same ideas. And then, of course, you have the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto entering the scene.
And the timing of Satoshi's arrival was, well, let's just say impeccable. You had the 2008 financial crisis in full swing. Trust in institutions was eroding. It really highlighted the very vulnerabilities of the system we've been talking about.
It's like the world was ready for something different, a radical change. And Bitcoin, with its promise of decentralization, transparency, it really stepped into that void.
Exactly. Satoshi took these existing ideas, the cypherpunk philosophy, the proof of work concept, the desire for a decentralized form of money, and found a way to combine them. Plus, he or she or they introduced some key innovations that address the flaws of things like eCash and BitGold.
So it sounds like Satoshi took those key ideas, proof of work, decentralization, this fixed supply, and like you said, they combined them in a way that just clicked where others hadn't. What were those missing ingredients? What did Bitcoin get right?
Well, one of the big breakthroughs with Bitcoin was how it used proof of work, not just for that digital scarcity we were talking about, but for security too, network security. Because you see, in a traditional system, you've got a central authority, a bank usually, that's in charge of validating transactions, making sure everything's on the up and up. Bitcoin flips that on its head. It spreads that responsibility across the entire network.
Okay, I have to ask, how does that actually work? Does everyone on the Bitcoin network have to, verify every single transaction?
That's the ingenious part. It's not about everyone doing the same thing. It's more about creating a system where it becomes almost impossible for anyone to mess with those transactions. Picture this, a race. Miners all over the world, they're competing to solve these really complex math problems. The first one to solve it, they get to add a block of transactions to the blockchain.
Which, that's Bitcoin's public ledger, right? Where everything's recorded.
Exactly. And here's the thing. The miner who solves the problem, they get rewarded with Bitcoin. So there's an incentive to keep the system going.
So it's like this self-governing system, a decentralized system, where the more people participate, the stronger it gets.
You got it. To actually take control of the Bitcoin network, to corrupt it, you'd have to control most of the computing power. And because it's spread out all over the world, well, let's just say that's a really, really tough thing to do. Costly, too.
Makes sense. And then there's that other groundbreaking part, that fixed supply you were talking about. Only 21 million Bitcoins ever existing. I mean, that's a far cry from how governments usually handle things, printing money whenever they want.
Exactly. And that hard limit, it's built into Bitcoin's code. It can't be changed. So it's immune to that inflationary pressure that, well, plagues traditional currencies, to put it mildly. That's a big part of why people compare Bitcoin to gold, that whole digital gold thing.
It really does all tie back together. But it makes you wonder, beyond the tech stuff, the economics, what does it all mean for everyday people? Why should someone care about Bitcoin?
Ugh, the million-dollar question. I think for a lot of people, Bitcoin represents a chance to, well, reimagine a financial system that they feel has been rigged against them for a long time. Remember that Hayekian ideal of spontaneous order? Bitcoin embodies that, but for money. It's free from arbitrary control, values determined by its users, not by some decree from on high.
It's like going back to a more fundamental form of money, something that's not controlled by governments or big institutions.
In a way, yes. It's about empowering individuals, giving them control over their finances, maybe even leveling the playing field a bit.
It's been quite a journey, I have to say, tracing this story with you, from the early internet all the way to, well, the birth of Bitcoin. I've got a lot to think about.
That's what's so exciting about these ideas. Realizing that Bitcoin, it's not just about the technology, the investment aspect, it's about challenging our assumptions about money itself, how it works, its role in our lives, the whole deal.
Big questions. So if someone was going to walk away from this conversation, this deep dive we've been on, what would you say is the most important thing for them to remember about Bitcoin?
That Bitcoin, even though it seems complicated on the surface, represents a powerful idea that we can build a more equitable, more transparent financial system from the ground up. One that puts individuals first. Will it work? Who knows? But the questions it raises about money, about power, about technology, those are questions we can't ignore.
You've certainly given us all a lot to ponder. And to everyone listening, what resonates with you most about this story, about Bitcoin? What possibilities do you see? What concerns do you have? We encourage you to keep exploring those questions, keep learning. Until next time.